definitely in many, many places, it is the instrument of regime change.
Yes.
And the U.S. is the only country in the world that relies on regime change as, I would say, the lead diplomatic, let me put it a different way, not diplomatic, as the lead foreign policy instrument. In other words, most countries, virtually any small country, any middle power country, when it doesn't like another country, it either has to deal with it or it comes begging to the United States to take out that country. And we are the country that makes a living by overthrowing other governments. And that's not a good vocation for us. It almost always ends in disaster, in bloodshed, in continued instability. But that's the job of the CIA. It's half the job of the CIA. The CIA is also an intelligence agency. It collects information and makes analysis, and it gives intelligence findings. And I have no problem with that role at all, although I don't want them to spy on us. But I think that making intelligence findings for the U.S. government is necessary. But being a private army or a hidden force that overthrows governments, that stokes unrest, that puts people in power, that runs covert operations, I'm against it.
So if a big part of the CIA's job is taking down leaders of foreign countries, how long before it does that here in the United States? I mean, it doesn't seem unlikely that, like, why wouldn't they do that here?
Yeah, probably 61 years ago was their first run at this with President Kennedy. From, I think it's best guess, not sure, but best guess that this was at least maybe rogue CIA or maybe official CIA, right, or maybe compartmentalized CIA operation. It was clearly someone's operation, not Lee Harvey Oswald's.
That's pretty obvious.
All we know, and all of the evidence points in that direction. It used to be said, why is the United States the only country in the world that's never had a coup? And the answer was, well, we're the only country that doesn't have a U.S. embassy.
Well, of course, we've had a coup. I mean, murdering the president is a coup.
But we probably had a coup in broad daylight on November 22nd, 1963. And we never quite got over it. And we never looked into it. On the contrary, we covered it up from the beginning. And drip by drip, evidence comes, including the most recent evidence that magic bullet, which was one of the justifications of the absurd account of a lone gunman, was also debunked by the, I think now 88-year-old Secret Service agent who said, I actually put that bullet from the back of Kennedy's seat in the limousine on the stretcher at Parkland Hospital. So there's so many things wrong with the official, and it's preposterous. Almost nobody believes it or should believe it. But it's also interesting for all that we're discussing. Most likely it was a government coup in broad daylight with a tremendous amount of evidence that it was a conspiracy at a high level. And yet it passed for the last 61 years without any official practical note of that fact.
Do you think that was the last time the CIA tried to influence domestic politics in this country?
Well, I'm sure the CIA influences domestic politics all the time in this country, because we know about extensive surveillance operations. But it's interesting, next year will be the 50th anniversary of the Church Committee hearings. Yes. And Frank Church was a very unusual figure from Idaho. A pretty staunch Republican state, and he was a young, gifted patriot whose favorite senator was Bora, a conservative Republican senator. And he was just an upright, very decent person who saw more and more My God, it's the things we're talking about. Something's not right. People are getting assassinated in other countries. Our government, it doesn't look clean. And one thing after another in a series of events led him to chair the only time a Senate investigative committee actually looked deeply into CIA operations. That was 1975. Fascinating. What made it possible was just a confluence of events. Nixon had resigned. Ford was an unelected president who came from Congress, who didn't want to take on Congress, so he didn't resist Church's investigation, even though his chief of staff, Dick Cheney, was telling him, "Go after this guy. We got to crush this investigation." But Ford said, "No, we can't." And anyway, the Supreme Court, and I don't want to get into another huge fight. Hoover had died. J. Edgar Hoover had died in 1972, I believe. So the FBI couldn't resist the same way. Bill Colby had become CIA director, and he didn't want to inherit all the shit from the past CIA. So there came this one moment when all these pieces enabled actually someone to look into what this organization was doing. And the first thing they discovered was no one had ever looked into any of it before. Nothing.
No.
Second, they discovered this is an army of the President of the United States.
Yes.
This is a private army. And they debated, is it a rogue army? Does it do it on its own? Or is it an army of the president? But it's an army. And it's an army completely outside of our oversight and control. Then the third thing they found is they're assassinating lots of people. They're assassinating Americans, by the way, through these unbelievably crazed LSD experiments.
Yes.
But they, basically, they weren't the ones to put the bullet through the head of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, but they tried, and they supported the overthrow of Lumumba, and of course they were trying to kill Castro and many other things. So they found unbelievable things. Now that was 1975. Since then, we're 49 years. There's never been another church committee of its kind. It's unbelievable how many things have happened since then. The list, believe me, is very, very long. I've seen some of it so directly, I can't, it's just shocking to me, but just an insight into how our country works, which you know very well. But to me, I find it so weird. I was asked to help Aristide in Haiti.
Yes.
Okay. Haiti's, so poor, so unstable, so desperate. And Aristide asked me for economic help. That's what I do. That's my expertise. So I flew down to Port-au-Prince, and I had a very good meeting with him. And at the end of the meeting, he said, "Mr. Sachs, they're going to take me out. They're going to take me out." And what do you mean? He said, they're going to overthrow me. Okay, sorry to be so naive as I am. I said, "No, we're going to make this work. We're going to make this work." No, they're going to take me out. I said, no, I'm going back to Washington. We're going to help with the Inter-American Development Bank and World Bank and IMF. And I'm so naive. So, of course, then they decide to take him out. And the way they do it is destabilize the country. So the first thing is close down the IMF, close down the World Bank, close down the Inter-American Development Bank, squeeze. The next thing is you send in some mercenaries who are going to create trouble, come over the border from Dominican Republic. The last thing was rather remarkable, which was the U.S. ambassador showed up at his door literally one day and said, "Mr. President, you have to flee. We have a plane waiting for you. Otherwise, your life is in danger." And they led him to a plane with an unmarked tail. And 23 hours later, he was in Central African Republic. So this is what's called a coup in broad daylight.
Central African Republic.
Absolutely.
I thought he went to Joburg. I don't know why.
No. He went afterwards, but the landing was Central African Republic, if I remember correctly. So I what do I do? What can I do? Well, I called up the New York Times reporter on the beat, and I said, there's been a coup on broad daylight. You got to cover this. The reporter told me, my editor's not interested.
A coup in our hemisphere.
All the news that's fit to print.
So I have wanted, it's just amazing. So I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, you said there have been no real oversight hearings into the intel agencies in 50 years.
Yes.
But, the congressional committees are only one part of the oversight the Constitution prescribes. And the other part, of course, is the media, right? It's supposed to provide oversight of government. And the moment I really wanted to speak to you was the day that I saw the clip of you on Bloomberg News. I think you were
one of my favorite moments.
And you just described it, and it was within hours of this massive natural gas pipeline, Nord Stream, disintegrating. Can you describe what happened?
Yeah. So, the U.S. blew up Nord Stream as it promised to on probably dozens of occasions. But the most recent of those occasions was President Biden said, I think it's February 7, 2022. I may have the date a little bit off, but he said in a statement to the press, if the Russians invade Ukraine, Nord Stream is finished. And the reporter who asked him the question, I think from Germany, but international, said, well, Mr. President, how can you say that? How could you do that? And he looks and he says very gravely, believe me, we have our ways. Okay, so this is, and then you could go back and find 1,000 clips of Victoria Nuland and Cruz and everyone saying, this must stop, we'll never let it happen, it will be destroyed, it will be ended. Okay, so then it's blown up, okay? And then the American, before we get to that, I was on Bloomberg soon afterwards. I don't remember whether it was the next day or the day after. And I said, I think the U.S. did this. Mr. Sachs, how can you say that? And I said, well, first the president said it was going to be over. And then there's actually, some readings of planes in the vicinity and so forth. And there was the tweet by the former and now current foreign minister of Poland. Thank you, USA, with a picture of the water bubbling over the blown up pipeline. Radek Sikorski's tweet. Yeah, there was
Anne Applebaum's husband.
Yes, there was a bit of evidence that, well, yes, the United States had done this. Thank you very much. They said they would, and they did it. I was yanked off the air within 30 seconds. I could imagine, because he was listening to something in the earplug, which I could only imagine, get that son of a bitch off the air. And they just, this interview's over, and he stopped. And then another anchor berated me for a few minutes after that. And okay, that was the last time I had a word on mainstream media, I have to tell you.
Seriously?
Yeah.
But you've been famous, because I live in this country, I know. You've been famous for decades.
Yeah, I was on everything, MSNBC.
Like a lot.
Yeah, a lot, constantly.
But it's so interesting that your sin was saying something true.
Right.
That the media really should be on. I mean, this is the largest act of industrial sabotage in my lifetime. It's the largest.
It's a big deal.
Carbon emission.
Yeah.
Ever.
It's a big deal. It's an act of war. It helps to understand what this Ukraine war is all about. It helps us to understand that this is a war between the United States and Russia, fought on many means. It's important to understand it. It also has a deeper economic significance because it's part of a long-standing U.S. idea of not letting Germany and Russia ever get too close together economically. So there's a lot to that story,
but the media should be covering that.
Look, if you can kill a president in broad daylight, and get away with it for 61 years, if you can walk a president of a neighboring country out to an unmarked plane and not have it covered, if you can have a, quote, unprovoked war that you provoked over a 30-year period, you can do lots of things. And this is just one of the things that you could do. And I discovered that some of our press, like the New York Times, which opined after the blow up that it looks like Russia did that, to their own to their own infrastructure. Their reporters, their top reporters know better. They tell me, yeah, Jeff, of course. But they don't cover it because we're living in an environment where the people in power think it's a game. And they think that it's not their job to tell us. They're playing Risk with our lives. They're playing Risk with Ukrainian lives. They don't have to tell us the truth. We don't have to have any serious discussion. We don't have to call anyone for a real hearing or even much less a congressional investigation. We're not living in that kind of world. We're living in a world where it's almost daily that the government says what it wants. Kirby at the White House says it with that damn smirk of his. And pretty much everyone knows it's lies.
But why haven't, it's just interesting because you're from a very specific class,
Yeah.
well-known academic, economist, diplomat, frequent TV guest. And, there are a bunch of other people in that world, but you were pretty much the only person to say, no, that's a lie, and I'm not going along with it. Why you? Why didn't you do what all of your peers did?
I do it because it came as part of my life course, working mostly internationally, talking with leaders abroad. I care about my credibility a lot, which is, I'm not always right, but I try to always be right.
Yes.
And I have a lot of discussions every day with foreign ministers or with senior diplomats or with heads of state. And for me, I don't hold an office. I don't do anything other than try to have reasonable ideas and speak as truthfully as possible. So it's kind of a career approach, which is I'm trying to be accurate.
Right, but there should be a lot of people like you in your world.
Yeah. I know for me, I'm not interested, and I would not take a job in the U.S. government, for example. I couldn't anyway, with all the things I've said. I can imagine the congressional hearings. It would be, did you say that about the U.S. government? Did you say that about the U.S. government? But in any event, I'm not looking for a job. I'm not looking for a USAID grant. I'm not looking for a U.S. government grant. So in that sense, also, I'm not exactly, I hope, trapped in that way. I'm just trying to be accurate. And what I'm really, really trying is to help the United States government understand they're operating on dangerous trajectories and with a lot of delusions. And it's very risky for everybody. And I also have a big measure of resentment. I don't like the risks that we're being put under, Tucker.
Yes, I agree with that completely.
I don't like it.
You got children.
This is not a game. I got grandchildren, and I really care about this, and I don't like the games, and I want people to tell the truth. And if we told the truth, we could actually stop the wars today. I don't mean, that sounds crazy. It's not crazy. If we told the truth about Ukraine, if Biden called Putin and said, that NATO enlargement we've been trying for 30 years, it's off. We get it. You're right. It's not going to your border. Ukraine should be neutral. That war would stop today. Oh, there'd be lots of pieces to figure out where exactly will the borders be. How will it go? I don't say that there won't be issues, but the fighting would stop today. If the government of Israel either were told or said, there will be a state of Palestine and we will live peacefully side by side, the fighting would stop today. These are basic facts, basic matters of truth that if we actually spoke them, if we actually treated each other like grown-ups, we would resolve what seem to be these, insurmountable crises. They're not at all insurmountable. They just require a measure of truth.
How have you been treated by your peers for saying things like, because I hear what you just said, and I think it's indisputable. It's also very honorable. You seem to be acting out of the best motives, traditional American motives, I would say.
Yeah,
I admire you
that.
for saying that. How have your peers responded to you?
They think I'm a little crazy, I think.
What would be crazy about what you just said?
Well, when I said that this war has a reason, that it's not that Putin's evil, that we provoked this, and that it could stop, I got most of my remaining interlocutors saying, Jeff, what is the matter with you? You're a Putin apologist? How dare you? When I say this about Israel, I lose another group.
Yes.
Because there are things you're supposed to say here. Because this idea of U.S. hegemony, this idea of U.S. dominance, it's pretty deep in American academia also. I mean, it's not a shock to tell you, but all of these special the think tanks or university special departments or research units, they're funded by the U.S. government. They're funded by the security state. They're funded by large donors that are all part of this story. So it's not absolutely simple to get out of that. I think Mark Twain, I think he was the one that said it. It may have been Mencken, but I think it's attributed to Twain that said it's impossible to convince a man of something when his job depends on on believing the other. And I think that's true of a lot of people, which is, I can't really say that. I don't know if it's true, but anyway, why are you sticking your head out so much?
I got to ask you about, first of all, thank you. I think that's the crispest and I think most honest description I've ever heard of the lead up to what's happening in Ukraine right now. So thank you for that. So given the credibility that you've just gained by that explanation, where do you think COVID came from?
COVID, the question is which lab and in which way. It almost surely did not come out of nature. It almost surely came out of a deliberate research project that had a core idea, which was to take a natural virus and make it more infectious. And we have one major blueprint of that, which is a research proposal called Diffuse, which was submitted to the Department of Defense, to the unit called DARPA in 2018. And it is a kind of cookbook for how to make the virus that causes COVID-19. And the virus is called SARS-CoV-2. And what's distinctive about SARS-CoV-2 is that it has something called a proteolytic cleavage site, and specifically something called a furin cleavage site. And it's just some pieces of the genome that make this thing damn infectious. Yeah. And what's interesting about it is that for this class of bat viruses, which are called beta coronaviruses, which is what SARS comes from and what COVID-19 comes from, for that class of viruses, and there are several hundred known, none of them in nature ever had that particular piece of the genome called none, other than SARS-CoV-2. And that piece of the genome, the furin cleavage site, was an object of research attention from 2005, because it was understood that if a virus were to have that, it would make the entry of the virus into human cells easier, and it would make the virus, therefore, infectious for humans. SARS-1, which was the first outbreak of a virus like this in 2003 in Hong Kong, was most likely a natural virus that came from a farm animal. And it was not so infectious. It killed some thousands of people. But with SARS-1, you got very, very sick for weeks before you were infectious to someone else. And that meant that it was not so hard to stop by isolating people who had the symptoms. With SARS-CoV-2, you are infectious even without any symptoms. Sometimes you're completely asymptomatic. So what's the difference of SARS-1 and SARS-CoV-2? The furin cleavage site. And in 2005 already, so almost 20 years ago, that experiment was done that said, oh, take SARS-1, add in a furin cleavage site, this thing becomes really infectious. And there are a series of experiments, 2005, 2009, 2011, that are called gain-of-function experiments where you deliberately manipulate the virus to make it more infectious. By 2015, we had a full-blown research program funded by NIH, by Tony Fauci's unit, on beta coronaviruses, already with the lead scientists focusing on this furin cleavage site. It's starting to get, so they're starting to do more and more targeted experiments.
May I ask why?
Yes.
Why would you want to take a virus like that and make it more infectious?
The overarching answer is called biodefense. And and then the real question, which I don't know the answer to, is that biowarfare or is that true defense? NIH, starting in 2001, became the Defense Department's research unit. So remember the anthrax attack that came after 9/11?
Very well.
Yes. After that,
I'm sorry to ask you, Paul. Do we know, or are you satisfied you know what that was?
that probably came out of AMRID. It was probably a U.S., some U.S. scientists either
For sure.
provoking or doing some crazy things or disgruntled or boosting up the DoD budget. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I know that after that, DoD put its budget through Tony Fauci's unit, which suddenly became the largest unit of NIH, and Fauci became the head of what is politely called biodefense. But one only suspects that it is, we're not supposed to do biowarfare.
It used to be called germ warfare, right?
Right. And I don't know. And they say, well, it's for vaccines against biowarfare. It's to defend against it. It's to defend against natural outbreaks. But what it is a tremendously dangerous research program that involves a lot of manipulation of very dangerous pathogens. And by 2015, the ability of scientists to manipulate these viruses was reaching astounding proportions. And we've got a real genius who was part of this group named Ralph Barrick at University of North Carolina, who is a genius. And what he could do was, if you gave him 30,000 letters of the DNA code, A, G, C, C, G, A, and so forth, and I mean, give him the letters, he'll turn that into a live virus. I think that's pretty damn remarkable. In other words, you give him the designer virus, he'll give you the live virus. And he created what's called a reverse genetic system to make these viruses and to put in pieces into the viruses with a technique which he also called no-seum, meaning you suture in a part, but you do it in a way that you can't identify that it was put in the lab, so it's without the fingerprints, as it were. And it's clear that this area of research picked up a tremendous amount of steam because a lot of American scientists were shouting, "This is so damn dangerous, stop it." And Fauci was saying, no, this is important. This is really crucial. We're going to continue to do this. There was a brief moratorium at the end of the Obama period, and then the moratorium was lifted during the Trump administration. And even during the moratorium period, we know that the research continued on many grants. It's clear when you look closely at this that they were getting closer and closer to this insertion of the furin cleavage site into SARS-like viruses. Now, in 2018 came this proposal. As always, this was a highly classified proposal. We only learned about it after the fact by a whistleblower. We never even would have learned about it, even in all of the commotion of the pandemic, but for a whistleblower, a brave whistleblower in the Department of Defense who said the public needs to see this. And when you look at the diffuse proposal, really you say, holy shit, because on page 10, it says, we have collected more than 180 previously unreported beta coronaviruses. And on page 11, it says we're going to test them for whether they have a proteolytic cleavage site, which is a furin cleavage site. And if they don't, we're going to insert a furin cleavage site into them. It's the goddamn cookbook for how to make this virus. So here comes the Defense Department turned it down, supposedly. I mean, probably did. And then comes the question, well, so what happened? Well, the people that wrote that little cookbook said, not us. We didn't do anything like that. No, it got turned down. Nothing to look at here. And there are all, I know because people have told me, oh, Jeff, it's not just that it got turned down. They had done the work even before they submitted the grant proposal. That's not uncommon in science, which is you do a lot of the work beforehand. So I've heard that on good authority. I can't verify it personally. And there are so many strands now that say, yeah, something really screwy was going on. For example, there's a very weird paper, weird to me, by Barrick and the head of what's called Rocky Mountain Laboratory, which is a NIH laboratory under Fauci's authority, that reports this completely bizarre finding. And the finding sounds very technical, but it says the Wuhan Institute of Virology type 1 virus does not infect Egyptian fruit bats. Okay, that's the title. So you say, so what the hell is that? What that is that obviously in 2019 and 2018, they were doing experiments using viruses from Wuhan in the Rocky Mountain labs with their collection of bats. Okay, so one theory, and the bats in Rocky Mountain Labs is called an Egyptian fruit bat. It's not the kind of bat that carries this virus in China, which is in Yunnan, which is a different kind of bat. But they tried it in Rocky Mountain Lab. I scratched my head and said, what the hell? We have Rocky Mountain Lab doing experiments with Wuhan viruses in Montana in NIH labs with Ralph Barrick, who is one of the principal investigators of the insert the furin cleavage site into the virus. I'd like to know more about that. Thank you. Isn't that curious? Then there are other scientists that have pieces of this puzzle. So the answer is we don't know exactly. One theory is that it was concocted in the US and sent over to Wuhan, to this Wuhan Institute of Virology, for testing in their bat collection, which is the Chinese bats rather than the Egyptian fruit bats. That's plausible. That's one person's theory. There are other theories that even a related research group, German and Dutch, may have played a role because they have in Wuhan research. But when the virus broke out, in that period at the end of 2019, early 2020, there's commotion among the scientists. What the hell is this? Where'd this come from? Oh my God, did we do this? How'd this escape or whatever? Nobody knows, of course. So they start having secret calls. And one of the most important of these calls was on February 1st, 2020, that was then memorialized by one of the participants in a long memo, all of which became public through a Freedom of Information Act subsequently, because our government has lied to us about every single moment of this from the start. Hasn't told us anything about any of this. It's all whistleblowers or Freedom of Information Act. That's the only way we know any of what I'm describing to you right now. No one has told the truth at all. So on the February 1st call, the scientists say, oh God, this looks like a lab stuff. One of them says, I can't figure out how this could have ever come out of nature. And they're all looking at the furin cleavage site because they know, this group of scientists knows that's the object of research. That's the goal. It's never been seen before in a virus like this. It's the signature right there. I did this. And 4 days later, that group authors the first draft of a paper called The Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2 that says it's a natural virus.
The same people wrote it?
The same people who privately said it's out of a lab, most likely.